Well, I really appreciate the opportunity to come and share with you this afternoon what we have done with some of the research initiative. It's an honor for me to be asked to speak to this group. I say that with all sincerity. I've known Michelle for a long time, and she's aware that in my career, I have been yelled at a lot by the industry people, and I've been yelled at a lot by the environmental side, and that'll probably happen again this afternoon, although Michelle told me that there would be no yelling at this conference. I think that to put this in perspective, we need to look at what is happening globally, and the Office of Economic Cooperation and Development within the UN, I have found that to be pretty objective and reliable information in their annual reports. And with their agricultural outlook for 2012 to 2021, they estimate that starting now, we're going to have to produce approximately 40 million more tons of meat a year to meet global demand. They also estimate that we're going to have to increase cereal production by 200 million tons annually, and that does not even include grains for biofuels. And biofuels would be another topic of discussion. So my point, and the point that I make to my students, is that we can debate whether it is right or wrong regarding meat protein consumption, but it's going up. It's going up globally. And we've had this discussion a little bit this afternoon. There are a lot of livestock and poultry produced in the state of North Carolina. About 900 million chickens per year. When I travel and I'm on a plane and someone asks me what do I do, and I say, well, I'm head of a poultry science department. They say, whoa, what is that? And I start sharing some of these numbers, they find it staggering. And these numbers are staggering. 35 million turkeys and over 3 billion table eggs. And for production, about 18 million hogs per year. This is all in North Carolina. But this is not just an issue related to North Carolina. If we look at numbers nationally, there's about 34 million head of beef, 110 million head of hogs, and again, close to 9 billion chickens and 80 billion eggs produced annually in the U.S. And globally, just to give you one example, for poultry, the number would be approximately 60 billion meat-type chickens produced a year. And these numbers are going up. They're continually going up for some of these commodities. And if you look at where we are with population, trying to identify the source of why we're in this room, from my perspective, you know what has happened with population. If we're talking about just the U.S., we're a little over 300 million now. And if you look at what has occurred relative to the number of people that on a day-to-day basis are involved in some type of agricultural production. This would be crops as well as livestock and poultry. You see what has happened since the 1800s when that percentage was around 70%, and down to today, it is less than 2%. And one thing that we know that is occurring is that these types of operations are getting closer to these types of operations or vice versa. But it's happening, and again, we have the issues that we have talked about this afternoon. And where I'm going with this is that The reason that Michelle, I think, invited me to talk is that I have a very strong philosophy that the way that we can address a lot of these issues, if not all of these issues, is with technology development. And this is an example of swine farm in North Carolina in 2016 now. And as you can see, this type of model would be the animals, of course, are produced within the facilities. The effluent is flushed to a lagoon. This is one area where I get yelled at by the environmental people because this is actually a treatment system. It is very good if you look at the data objectively for reducing carbon and BOD demand. It is a very good system. It's used in some municipalities as well. But there are issues. There are issues with this type of model. And again, my philosophy is you address these issues with technology applications. I want to also share with you a swine farm in China. I was in China. This was January of 2014. I've been to China several times in my career. I can tell you, and again, we can debate what it means, whether it's right or whether it is wrong. The changes in the production model of swine, and I've also seen it with poultry, in China over the past 2 decades is dramatic. It is dramatic. And on this particular farm that I was on, if you look at these facilities and you go back and look at these, there's not a lot of difference. And when I first went to China in the early 1990s, you did not see this type of production, but they still then and now are producing about 50% of the hogs in the world, 50% now. One thing that I'll also point out on this same site, if you look very closely, this is actually a mesophilic anaerobic digester, where they were taking the waste stream from these buildings and they were using it to generate biogas, which was used to be converted into energy, either direct energy of the gas burn or to turn a turbine to put it into the grid. On the day that I was there in January, and the wind direction was coming towards us, this actual facility would have, in my view, passed the odor emission standards that I'm going to talk about relative to the new standards for expanding swine facilities in North Carolina. But odor is only one of the 5, but we're going to talk about that. Another thing that I communicate to my students is that if we look at this demand and we look at what is going to occur relative to meat, milk, and egg production, relative to food security, these are the issues that are real. Increase in urbanization. There's already less farm land available, less water available. There is intense, and there will continue to be more intense competition for water between agricultural and non-agricultural industries. I'm already seeing that. Specifically, what I've been asked to talk about, increase in environmental emissions, greenhouse gases, and particulates. And for the impact on the industry, the increase in perception issues, whether they are real or whether they are not, regarding how livestock and poultry are produced. You've heard a lot in the last few minutes about antibiotic use. I personally feel, and I will share with you, I'm 64 years old. And so I'm hope that I have a few more years. I personally feel, based on the interaction that I have with livestock and poultry companies, and that's a lot. I do a lot of that with my job. I've done a lot of that in my career. I very strongly feel that within my lifetime, you will see almost complete phase out of antibiotic use for disease prevention, and the veterinary feed directive, as you have already heard, that comes into effect in just 2 more months, will prevent it, that use for subtherapeutic growth promotion. And the reason for that, and they made the comment very correctly, it's consumer driven. It's advocacy. Not too long ago, and this person did not say this to me off the record, this person was about 3rd in command with a large global meat production company. And his comment to me was, Mike, we listen to EPA, we listen to FDA, we have to. But the ones that we really listen to are the Walmarts and the McDonald's, because if they don't buy our product, we're not going to be in business. And again, I feel very strongly that the use of antibiotics in animal production agriculture, you're going to see a dramatic decrease over the next decade and beyond because of what is happening with consumer demand. Okay, now let me get into what the industry yells at me about. If you look at the way livestock and poultry are produced in the U.S., and this is mostly global as well, the permitted management process for components of the waste stream, nutrients in particular, are managed by land application close to where the animals are produced. I have said several times in my career, and again have been yelled at several times, that is not a sustainable model. It is not sustainable, and we need to think of sustainability generationally, not next year, not a decade from now, but 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 generations as a minimum relative to environmental sustainability. And these models of managing the waste stream are not generationally sustainable. And with any industry, the approach for change is technology. And that has been a primary focus of my career. And as Michelle talked about earlier, in 2000, there was an agreement between our Attorney General and Smithfield Foods, and also Premium Standard Farms, and a group of farmers called Frontline Farmers, to develop and to identify so-called environmentally superior technology. I did not lobby for it, but I agreed to be the so-called designee and the coordinator and the decision maker in that project. And we went through a very competitive process to identify technologies, some from university researchers, some from, most of them from the private sector. But again, a competitive process with a 20-plus appointed advisory panel. And we put these technologies on commercial farms in most cases. A few of the technologies were actually on our research facility associated at NC State University, but the majority of them were put on commercial farm sites. And it took cooperation from producers for us to be able to do that. I don't think you'll mind too bad. I'm going to point out one producer. Tom Butler is in the audience today. It's people like Tom Butler and Julian Barham, who I'm going to talk about a little bit later. We used one of his farm sites that enable us to do this type of research on commercial farms to get the answers that we need that you can't get by doing it in a laboratory or on a pilot scale. So we put 15 technologies on farms with this initiative, And what did we measure? We were mandated to measure 5 environmental parameters. And those are the ones that I have indicated here in black. The ones in red, I use this slide to indicate from my perspective and my experience what are also current as well as emerging environmental parameters of concern. I might be able, and this is good news, I'm sure, for this audience, and I very much think it is good news. I think I can probably take arsenic off of this list pretty soon because the FDA, it does move slow, but the FDA did did have a role in the company that produced an arsenical compound that was used widely in the poultry industry to prevent coccidiosis off the market. So I think you're not going to see the environmental associated issues with arsenic as has been discussed in recent years. We talked about antibiotic resistant particulates associated with ammonia emissions that react. Ammonia, it's going to do one of 3 things. It's going to come back to the surface of the earth once it is emitted from a livestock or poultry operation or any other type of industrial operation. It's going to come back to the surface of the earth either as dry fall or wet fall, not as acid rain, but as dry fall or wet fall, or it's going to react with an acidic compound in the atmosphere and be converted to a fine particle particulate, which is not good. And then, of course, greenhouse emissions associated with climate change and global warming. Another topic that I've been yelled at a lot, I have very strong feelings about that. I tell my students regarding emission impacts and climate change and global warming, it's not a question of whether it is real or not. It's a question of whether we're going to do something about it or are we going to live with the consequences. Unfortunately, it seems like we're taking the path of living with the consequences. Okay, what did we do with this very comprehensive study? We had to measure 5 identified environmental parameters that were mandated by the agreement and really by the North Carolina legislature. I'll also point out someone else that's in the audience today, Dr. Vinay Aneja. He coordinated the research team on this project that did the measurements for 3 of those 5: ammonia emissions, odor emissions, and pathogenic bacteria. But we quantified what those environmental standards would be in this process. We had a very diverse group of stakeholders on that 20-plus advisory panel. And on this, we reached consensus. We did have a little debate about property line related to odor, but we reached consensus on that. And you see the references down here. Everything that we did in this initiative is public domain. It's as transparent as it can be. All of this information is published. All of it is on our website. It is thousands of pages. You can get into it as deep as you want to, but it's all there. The agreement also mandated that we do not only environmental performance verification, but we do an economic feasibility determination, and that metric was the projected 10-year annualized cost of the technology had to include capital cost as well as maintenance per 1,000-pound steady-state live weight of hogs for each category of farm system. And that would include any return based on projected revenues such as energy or carbon trading, etc. Okay, what did we find on the economics? I cannot overemphasize how critically important this is. This was with our first set of determinations, and the agreement also mandated that we do that same economic metric for the lagoon spray fill system. And the economists determined that that was about $90. One of those 5 technologies that performed very well was the so-called super soils technology. That was determined to be $400. All right. What was the economic feasibility metric that we determined? On this topic, with my 20-plus advisory panel, I could not reach consensus. It is the only component of all the work that we did that has a minority report. And again, it's published. You can read it. But based on the input that I got from the academics and the policy people on that advisory panel, my decision was that the economic feasibility metric would be in the range of $90 to $115 to $125. And I say that range because the interpretation by some of the economists also is not in consensus. But it would be in that range relative to making a technology determination. So going forward with the research, we were able to get, through the Attorney General environmental enhancement support, we were able to get resources to do a second generation of that expensive so-called super soils technology. And please understand, I cannot be interpreted as promoting any type of technology with my communication to you today relative to a specific company. But I can for the process. And it made a lot of sense to go to a second generation on a technology that had shown such good environmental performance because of the learning curve that we had gone through and because the environmental performance metrics had been quantified. And you can apply value engineering principles to try to get the cost down, but to keep the environmental performance where it needed to be. And this was the second generation super soils. And we got the cost down, still not down as much as we wanted to. We were able to get resources through the Clean Water Management Trust Fund to do a third generation of that technology. And you can see, looking at the infrastructure here, it's quite different from a lagoon spray fill type technology. So let's look at some of the numbers. This was the third generation. And looking at environmental parameters, we got nearly 100% reduction on BOD solids. Dr. Aneja, look at that, 99% reduction on ammonia. This would be ammonia emissions, not organic ammonia that would be in the liquid waste stream. This particular technology used a nitrification, denitrification process similar to what is used with a lot of municipalities to nitrify that ammonia and then denitrify it to nitrogen gas. 99% reduction. 88% reduction on phosphorus that was used through a polymer addition process. That process also reduced the pathogens. This was pathogenic bacteria. We got greater than a 4-log reduction. Odor compounds, 99.9% reduction. That's pretty good. And metals, we were mandated to look at copper and zinc, and we got 95 to 97% reduction. Again, the 5 environmental parameters that we were mandated to measure: nutrients, relative to impact on surface and groundwater, emissions of ammonia, emissions of odor, pathogenic bacteria, and heavy metals. So look at the comparison. With this particular technology that we did, and they changed their name by the time they did the third generation, it was about $400 on that metric for the first generation, knocked off $100 with the second, and on the third generation, got it down to about $160. Jay Price, who was with the News and Observer for several years, he followed this project very closely over the years. And when Jay read this report after we issued the third generation report, he called me for an interview and he made the comment. He said, "Mike, you're on the 5-yard line getting ready to score." Maybe that's a bad analogy for us NC State people this year. But my comment back to Jay was, "Jay, I don't think we're on the 5-yard line, but we definitely are in the red zone." My point is, we're moving the needle. The research has moved the needle to getting the cost down to where it can be affordable. Now, I want you to carefully consider another technology that we looked at. This was a so-called Barham farm. This used a technology that was an ambient anaerobic digester, similar to what Mr. Butler has on his farms now. And if you, this is the farm site, and if you look real close, these little tanks here are these tanks. They are nitrifying tanks that are nitrifying the organic nitrogen that is held after it comes out of that in-ground digester in this holding area. And then that nitrified component was then used to flush the buildings. The anaerobic environment in those buildings beneath the slats was causing it to be nitrified, denitrified pretty well, and converted to ammonia gas. And some of the nutrients were actually used for, at that time, Mr. Barham was using it to grow tomatoes. And Mark Sobseed, School of Public Health, Chapel Hill, actually did a study because we wanted to see if any of the pathogens were getting into the tomatoes. And his analysis was tomatoes are going to get more pathogens on them from people handling the tomatoes with their hands in the grocery store than they are from any transmission using this waste stream, which was very good news. So look at the environmental parameters for this particular technology. Very good reduction on COD and solids, but only about 30% for ammonia emission reduction. And again, Dr. Naja's team made these measurements. Good energy production. This was an ambient temperature anaerobic digester, so more energy was going to be produced in the summer months than the winter months. Pretty good reduction on pathogens as well as odor. And the standard that we established in this process was that this number on a scale of 0 to 8, with 8 being the maximum offensiveness and 0 being no odor, anything below 2 would be considered a low enough odor concentration to meet the standard, and that had to be at the property line. So we established that it would be 400 meters from the source, which is pretty conservative, I think. But with the construct of the agreement, you had to hit a home run on all 5. And this is not good enough for ammonia. This needs to be in the 75% range. My point here is that, if you go back to the economic analysis, look at the economic determination for this farm. it is within the realm of the economic feasibility parameter that was established with this process. So from a research and development perspective, I really would like to see us be able to go back and focus on just that ammonia emissions component with those nitrifying tanks at that farm. And Michelle, I think this is pretty close to my last slide, but my point here is that in this forum, I wanted to get at least one slide where I had NC State and Duke University on the same slide. But we talked a little bit about research. Research is expensive. Research does take time if you do it correctly. I don't know any way to get around that. The analogy, you can't microwave this, is exactly correct. But in this particular, my point here is that these are controversial emission parameters that we all talk about, we all argue about. It ends up in court, it goes to litigation, but you can measure it. You can measure it. Dr. Sue Schiffman was on Dr. Naja's team from Duke University. She developed just a beautiful model using Eulerian-Lagrangian model to simulate odor dispersion. She and her team went on these sites. They spent a lot of time. They took samples. They took it to the olfactometry laboratory. It was measured. And she essentially established a grid where you could look down from above and you could, on that 0 to 8 model scale for odor, you could model it. So she did it for each of the technology sites from a wind direction or an orientation of the buildings north, south, east, and west. So those of you that are pretty perceptive, this is the aerial view. Which orientation is that relative to her model? It's south, because these are the buildings here with her measured values per the model she established. The odor intensity is high, as you would anticipate it to be within the building, but look what happens with the emission. It very quickly, well below, before 400 meters, gets blue, and that's what you want. Again, my point is, you can measure these things. The technology development is expensive, but that is the way that we need to be moving to get these technologies onto these farms. And so I will conclude by making some statements regarding the policy impact. I know that many of you in this room have influence on policy. I can tell you that the biggest miscalculation that I have made in my professional career is that when we started this work in 2000, I would have bet the farm that by now we would have a robust carbon trading system in the U.S. and that we would also have a robust renewable energies program. If that had occurred, several of these technologies, looking at objective evidence, would meet the economic feasibility standards, and we could be getting them onto farms. We need, this to me is not so much a technology issue, it is an economic issue, it is a community issue, it is a policy issue. Some things have happened that have been moving the needle in the right direction, but I have been very discouraged by the overall state and national movement relative to carbon trading, and renewable energy. It could have a major impact on the direction that we need to go with livestock and poultry production to address the environmental sustainability issue from a generational perspective. Moving these technologies from one part of the world to another, just because the environmental policy is different, is not the way to go. That does not address global sustainability, because we need to be addressing sustainability not just regional or national, it has to be global. So, with that, again, thank you so much for the invitation to present this afternoon. Thank you, Michelle.